Claire Thompson had not expected the attic to feel so heavy with dust and memory. The July light through the small window turned the air into a golden haze, each mote spinning in slow circles. She had come to Seattle to help her mother, Alice, sort through decades of belongings before selling the family home. It was meant to be a practical trip, a week of lifting boxes and making donation piles. The attic was cramped and sloped, its beams low enough that Claire had to stoop. Cardboard towers leaned in quiet surrender, and forgotten furniture hid beneath yellowed sheets. Near the far corner, she spotted a stack of shoeboxes tied with elastic bands. One box was wedged behind an old trunk, its lid slightly buckled. When she pulled it free, the rubber band resisted as though guarding what lay inside. It snapped against her wrist, and the lid shifted. Inside, letters lay bundled with faded ribbon, their envelopes stamped in the late 1990s. Resting on top was a Polaroid, its colors softened with age but still vivid enough to stir unease. The photograph showed her mother, visibly pregnant, standing by the Pike Place waterfront. Beside her was a man Claire had never seen before, his leather jacket creased at the elbows, one hand resting with quiet intimacy on her rounded stomach. Behind them, the market stalls blurred into a backdrop of autumn tones. Turning the photo over, Claire saw a handwritten note. The ink had bled slightly into the paper fibers, but the words were clear. "When September comes, we start anew." The casual optimism in the script contrasted with the unshakable tremor that passed through her hands. Beneath the photograph lay a hospital tag, the kind fastened around a newborn's wrist. The printed name carried her mother's maiden surname, but paired with a man's last name Claire had never encountered. It was not Brown, the name of her stepfather David, the man she had called Dad all her life. The weight of the discovery seemed to alter the air in the attic. Claire sifted through the letters, each one written in the same slanted handwriting. The words were tender yet cautious, weaving between everyday details and subtle references to your parents' pressure and finding our own way. Every sentence hinted at a life carefully hidden. She read them slowly, the attic heat pressing against her skin, the smell of paper and dust thick in her lungs. The letters spoke of anticipation for a child, of small plans for a shared home, of a promise to wait for the right moment. The absence of her stepfather in these words was as loud as the presence of the unknown man. Her pulse quickened with the realization that the timeline did not fit what she had always been told. The story of her parents' meeting, the wedding, her birth, it all began to feel like a carefully constructed sequence rather than a lived truth. She noticed that the letters stopped abruptly, as if the thread of that life had been cut. Holding the hospital tag, she tried to picture the man in the leather jacket in a delivery room, waiting to hold her for the first time. The image felt both impossibly real and wholly foreign. She could not reconcile it with the photographs of her stepfather cradling her as an infant, the ones framed in the hallway. The silence of the attic deepened as she placed the items back in the box, each return movement deliberate. The discovery did not fit neatly into any category. It was neither a clear betrayal nor an innocent relic. It was a fracture, a seam in her life that had been invisible until now. She closed her eyes, letting the dust settle back onto the surfaces, and felt the ground shift beneath her sense of self. The man in the photograph had a half-smile that seemed directed at her mother alone. His presence in that moment, captured and tucked away, was undeniable. Her mind reached for explanations, for a version of events that could stitch these pieces together without unraveling everything else. But the handwriting on the backs of the envelopes, the intimacy in the captured gesture, and the mismatched surname on the hospital tag all resisted the comfort of easy answers. Claire realized that this was not just a box of keepsakes. It was a quiet archive of a life that had run parallel to the one she knew, intersecting only in her own existence. She wondered how many times her mother had opened this box over the years, and what memories had stirred each time. The attic seemed smaller now, the slanted ceiling pressing closer. She set the lid back on the shoebox and tightened the elastic again, though it no longer felt secure. The knowledge was out, even if the objects remained hidden. It would travel with her, altering the shape of everything familiar. Descending the narrow stairs, she carried the weight of the box in her mind rather than her hands. The letters, the photograph, the hospital tag. They had already taken up residence in her thoughts, each detail replaying in quiet loops. She stepped into the cooler air of the hallway, but the unease stayed with her. For the first time, she considered the possibility that her family story was incomplete by design. And with that came an unspoken truth. Finding the missing pieces might mean dismantling the version of her life she had always been told. Claire's workdays began to unravel in ways she could not control. Her monitor filled with design files in Figma, yet her eyes drifted to the envelope stack now resting on her desk. She switched between interface layouts and faded paper, the present and the past overlapping in a quiet, steady rhythm. Every task felt split, half in her job and half in the box from the attic. She ordered a DNA test kit from a well-known online service, her fingers moving through the checkout process with the same mechanical efficiency she used for onboarding new software. The sterile steps, spit tube, seal bag, register barcode, felt almost reassuring. She treated them as a project, something with a timeline and deliverables. After mailing the sample, she marked the estimated processing date on her calendar. The countdown became a private clock ticking behind all her daily obligations. In the evenings, she opened her laptop not for work, but for the Seattle City Archives, scrolling through digitized newspapers from 1994 and 1995. One article described a student jazz festival in Capitol Hill. The name leapt from the screen. Michael Rivera, saxophonist, part of a quartet praised for its improvisational style. Another report covered a university charity gala, its photograph showing Alice in a committee of young volunteers, her smile both familiar and distant. The database of the DNA service began to build her genetic tree. At first, the list of matches felt meaningless, fourth cousins, fifth cousins, but then a surname appeared that stopped her, Rivera, from Tacoma. The connection was distant, but statistically significant. It was no longer random. Weeks later, a stronger match emerged. Olivia Rivera, with a percentage suggesting a possible paternal aunt. Claire read the number 3 times, her analytical mind unwilling to accept a single pass as proof. She opened spreadsheets to cross-check the probability ranges published by the service. She laid the letters in chronological order, aligning postmarks with the festival date and the charity gala. The tone of the writing subtly changed after each event, as if external pressures had started to close in. The postmarks themselves bore the ink smudges of haste, something she had never noticed before. One letter, folded into careful thirds, held a small business card. The print had faded, but she could still read, Ballard Avenue Recording Studio, a phone number below. A quick search showed the studio had been closed for years, yet the name persisted in old city directories and cached scans of entertainment listings. Her nights became a blend of algorithm and instinct. She toggled between ancestry databases, news archives, and mapping tools, building a visual web of places, names, and dates. The central nodes, Alice Thompson, Michael Rivera, glowed on her digital map like beacons, pulling the other connections toward them. The process felt strangely parallel to her professional work. She approached the search as if it were a user journey to be traced. The triggers, the actions, the decision points. But here, the user was her own mother, and the journey was 28 years old. The match with Olivia Rivera returned more detailed data, a list of shared genetic markers, the strength of the segments. Claire copied everything into her personal archive. The name Olivia became more than a statistic. It was a person, somewhere within driving distance, who carried the same sequences of DNA. She imagined the letter's author playing saxophone at the festival mentioned in the archives, maybe looking toward the audience for a familiar face. She imagined Alice, younger, watching from the crowd, aware of both possibility and risk. These were reconstructions, Claire knew, but they gave weight to the fragments. The algorithms did their part, running silently in the background, comparing her profile against millions of others. But the human element, reading, cross-referencing, remembering, was what began to close the gap. Claire could feel the outline of a truth forming, even if it wasn't yet fully visible. She opened old online maps of Ballard Avenue, searching for images from before the studio closed. A low brick building appeared in a Street View archive, its sign barely legible. She saved the image, pairing it with the business card from the letter. It felt like a breadcrumb preserved against time. The more she aligned the archival data with the genetic results, the less room there was for coincidence. The overlap of the Rivera name, the geographic proximity, the dates, it all pointed in the same direction. Yet she refused to call it certainty until every angle was tested. Claire began to notice her own behavior changing. Work deadlines felt secondary to the quiet investigations that stretched past midnight. Her inbox filled with unreturned messages from colleagues, while her browser filled with tabs leading deeper into the life of a man she had never met. She kept the shoebox close, no longer hidden in the attic but within arm's reach. It had become both an artifact and a guide, its contents dictating the next search, the next verification. Each piece was fragile but carried the weight of a foundation stone. The days blurred, the boundaries between her professional projects and her personal research dissolving. She measured progress not in design milestones, but in genetic segment matches, in archived articles retrieved, in faint names recovered from yellowed paper. The algorithms continued to work silently, matching her DNA against the world. But Claire understood that the most important part of the process was not the blood or the code. It was the persistence to follow every thread until it led somewhere she could stand. Claire took 2 days off from work, closing her laptop without answering the queue of project emails. The decision to go to Seattle had settled in her mind like a weight. It no longer felt optional. She packed a small bag, checked the weather, and slid behind the wheel of her Subaru before dawn, leaving Portland's streets empty in her rearview mirror. The highway north unfolded in long, damp stretches. She drove without music, letting the hum of the engine steady her thoughts. The closer she came to Seattle, the more the skyline felt like an outline she had always known, but never truly entered on her own terms. She did not tell Alice she was coming. There was no plan to stop by the family home. This trip belonged to a different purpose, one she was not ready to explain. By mid-morning, she arrived at her friend's apartment in Ballard, a modest 2-bedroom with a view of fishing boats moored along the canal. In the small kitchen, Claire cleared the table and unfolded a printed map of Seattle. The paper smelled faintly of ink and coffee, the grid of streets spreading between her hands. She took a pack of sticky notes and began marking locations in bright yellow squares. The first point was the former recording studio on Ballard Avenue. She had traced it from the address on the old business card found in the attic box. Though the studio had closed years ago, it was where the letters hinted her search might begin. The second sticky note marked a bar in Belltown. Old event listings online showed jazz sets held there in the mid-1990s, with the Rivera Quartet featured more than once. The name had appeared enough times to feel deliberate, not just coincidence. The third note landed over the University of Washington campus, specifically the archive building that housed alumni records. She had read that yearbooks and performance programs from past decades were stored there, open to anyone who asked. The next morning, she started at the university archive. The building's quiet was thick, broken only by the sound of pages turning. She signed a request slip and waited at a wooden table until an archivist brought out a large bound volume wrapped in tissue. Inside, she found the music department's graduation pages from 1995. Her eyes stopped on a black and white portrait labeled Michael Rivera, his expression earnest, a saxophone resting upright beside him. Next to the image, a note mentioned his scholarship and his role in the city's big band. Beneath the photo, a short biography stated he was the son of a mechanic from Tacoma that he had toured with a jazz ensemble in the months after graduation. The facts were sparse, but each line felt like a confirmation. She took careful photographs of the pages with her phone. From the university, she drove to the Belltown bar. The exterior had changed, the awning replaced, and windows framed in polished metal. Inside, new posters for local indie shows covered the walls, but near the entrance, beneath layers of paper, she noticed the edge of something older. A corner of peeling poster revealed faded block letters. Rivera Quartet, September set. The year had been lost to damage, but the name was clear. She pressed her fingers to the wall lightly, as if touch might recover more details than sight alone. The bartender, a man with weathered hands and a slow voice, noticed her interest. He had worked there since vinyl was worth more than pizza, as he put it. When she asked about Rivera, he recalled a sudden disappearance years ago after what he vaguely called some trouble. He did not elaborate, but mentioned hearing that Rivera had been teaching at an art school for teens in Bremerton for a couple of years, sometime before the pandemic. He pulled out a scrap of paper and wrote down a phone number from memory. Back at her friend's apartment, Claire added a fourth sticky note to the map, marking Bremerton across the water. She drew a faint line connecting it to Seattle, then to Tacoma, creating a triangle of possible movement in his life. That evening, she sat at the table with her phone, hesitating before dialing. The voice that answered was bright, professional, confirming she had reached the art school. Yes, Michael Rivera still taught there, running an improvisation workshop every Friday afternoon. She wrote the details carefully in her notebook, underlining the day and time. The information was current, tangible, something she could walk into and witness for herself. The map now felt less like a puzzle and more like an itinerary. The kitchen filled with the sound of rain against the window, a steady rhythm that matched her pulse. She looked at the points she had marked, the sticky notes glowing under the overhead light, and felt the geography of her search tighten into focus. Each location held a fragment of his life, moments preserved in photographs, posters, and casual recollections. Claire understood that she was no longer just gathering data. She was closing the distance between questions and answers. The map would stay on the table, untouched except for new lines and notes. Tomorrow, she would decide whether to make the final drive. On Friday morning, Claire boarded the ferry bound for Bremerton. The deck was cool with salt air, and behind her the green wake stretched in a soft ribbon across Elliott Bay. She stood at the rail for most of the crossing, her fingers resting on the metal, feeling the vibration of the engines beneath her. The city skyline receded, dissolving into a muted blue haze. She carried only a tote bag with the Polaroid, the letters, and a notebook. The weight of these items was slight, but the meaning they carried seemed to press down on her shoulders. Each mile across the water felt like a step deeper into something that could not be reversed. The ferry's slow rhythm gave her time to rehearse nothing and everything. She thought of the photographs, the handwriting, the matching DNA results that still glowed on her phone screen. Yet, beyond the evidence, she wondered about his voice, his face, and whether she would recognize something of herself there. When the ferry docked, she walked through the small terminal and followed a short uphill route toward the art school. The building was modest, brick-faced with tall windows that spilled warm light onto the sidewalk. She could hear the low hum of instruments tuning before she stepped inside. In a classroom arranged like a small studio, she saw him. He sat on a wooden chair, a saxophone resting across his knees, his hair dark with a silver streak at the temple. There was a stillness about him that was not fragile but deliberate, as if he had learned to hold quiet moments close. The students played in small groups, their sound uneven but earnest. He listened with a half smile, tapping his foot in soft time, offering a nod here, a gesture there. Claire stayed near the doorway, unnoticed, until the session ended and the students began to pack away their instruments. When the room emptied, she approached. Without words, she set the Polaroid and the letters on the table in front of him. His gaze dropped to the photograph first, and something in his posture shifted. He traced the edges with his fingertips, his expression unreadable, but anchored in memory. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. It was of the same woman in the Polaroid, Alice, younger, her hair caught by wind. The corners of the photo were frayed, as though it had been carried for years in the same place, surviving countless folds and creases. From there, the story unfolded without embellishment. In 1995, just before Claire's birth, Alice's parents had insisted on a marriage that fit the image of respectability. They arranged a quiet wedding with David, a colleague of Alice's father. Michael had been told to step aside. He described how he had written, called, and even come to the house, each time turned away. There had been threats of legal action for harassment, letters returned unopened. The message had been clear: for the child's sake, he must disappear. When Claire was born, he received word, through Alice's family, that she would be better off without him. He was told Alice did not want to see him, that she wanted to move on without the disruption his presence would bring. Michael never married and never had other children. He moved to Tacoma, stayed with friends, played in small clubs, and taught music when he could. Every September 12th, he went to the waterfront and left a single white gerbera on the rail. It was his way of marking her birthday without intruding into her life. Claire listened, the sound of his voice steady, but edged with years of restraint. The details were unadorned, but each one carried the weight of choice and consequence. The gesture of the annual flower struck her as both unbearably tender and unbearably sad. She felt irritation rise against her mother's long-standing certainty that a lie, told consistently, could transform into a form of care. It was a belief that had shaped Claire's entire life without her consent. They agreed to take a paternity test at a Seattle clinic. The decision was made in quiet, practical terms, as though scheduling an appointment for a minor errand. But Claire felt its gravity. This was not proof she needed for herself. It was the kind she would need to stand against denial. They photographed the documents they each carried, cross-checking dates. His handwriting from the letters matched without hesitation. The hospital tag's surname aligned with the one on his driver's license. Details layered into an unshakable pattern. The following week, the test results arrived. Claire opened the envelope alone in her apartment, the clinical wording blunt in its certainty. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. She read the number twice, then a third time, letting its weight settle. The paper was thin, easily torn, but to her it felt like armor. It was the first tangible proof that could not be argued away by selective memory or carefully shaped stories. It was not just about who her father was, it was about reclaiming her own history. She folded the document carefully, slid it into her notebook, and knew she would carry it with her until the day came to place it in front of her mother. That day had not yet arrived, but for the first time, she could see its shape on the horizon. The rented hall in Belltown was dressed in muted gold and deep green, the colors chosen by Alice to mark her mother's 60th birthday. Round tables stood in neat rows, each with small floral arrangements and polished silverware. The smell of catered food mixed with the faint sweetness of champagne poured into waiting glasses. Relatives arrived in clusters, their voices rising and falling in bursts of greetings. Coats were draped over chairbacks, handbags placed carefully under tables. From the stage area, a large screen looped a slideshow of family photographs. Images of children's birthdays, summer picnics, and holidays scrolled past, each pause punctuated by soft music. One slide showed David cradling an infant Claire, his smile broad and unguarded. Across the bottom of the image, in elegant script, the words, "Family is a choice," appeared. To most in the room, it was a sentimental note. To Claire, it felt like deliberate irony carved in light. She entered quietly with Michael beside her. His dark jacket contrasted with the bright attire of the guests, his expression unreadable but steady. In her hand, she carried a plain leather folder, the clasp closed but the edges already worn from use. They moved to a space near the front of the room where the projector's light reached across the floor. Conversations slowed, the shift in attention almost imperceptible at first. Then, as faces turned, the hum of voices faded into a quieter, more pointed murmur. Claire opened the folder and laid its contents on the nearest table. The DNA results were clipped neatly at the top, followed by photocopies of letters, screenshots from the genealogy service, and a scanned image of the hospital tag bearing the surname Rivera. She spoke with measured calm, outlining the timeline. She described how the letters matched the postmarks, how the bar poster and the university archive connected to the genetic data. Each point was laid down like a marker on a path, guiding the room through nearly 3 decades of concealed truth. The whispers grew louder. Aunts leaned toward one another, their eyes darting between Alice and the papers. Someone adjusted the lights, the brightness sharpening every detail of the scene. Claire kept speaking, not raising her voice, but filling the space with the clarity of her account. David stepped back toward the dessert table, his hand brushing the edge of the cake stand. His face had gone pale, his jaw tight, but he did not interrupt. In his stillness was a kind of silent concession, an acknowledgement that the version of the story he had lived by was not the whole one. Alice remained in the center of the room, as if caught beneath a theater spotlight. Her posture was composed, but the small movements of her hands betrayed the strain. She began to frame her defense in the language of protection, speaking of her daughter's welfare and the morals of the time when she was 20. Yet the documents in front of them resisted such framing. The letters containing threats to leave in peace sat beside check stubs from her father's law firm, all tucked in the same box. On a date that matched Michael's disappearance, a bank record showed payment to a private security agency. Claire's presentation did not carry the tone of revenge. It was precise, more like a surgeon's incision meant to release what had been festering. The facts aligned too cleanly to be dismissed as misunderstanding. Each piece was a stitch removed from the old fabric of their family story. Michael stayed silent, not moving toward the table, not asking for a seat. His gaze remained on Claire, steady and open, as if meeting her eyes was enough to bridge the years between them. He stood with the quiet certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. At one point, the slideshow froze. The image on the screen showed Alice and Michael together on the waterfront, years younger, the tide behind them caught in sunlight. It was a moment before decisions, before distance, preserved now by accident in the loop of family memories. An elderly grandmother shifted in her chair, asking softly for water. The request seemed to ripple outward, breaking the tension's sharpest edge. Guests looked down at their plates, adjusted napkins, or glanced toward the exit, unsure whether the celebration had ended or simply paused. The room held its breath in the wake of the revelation. Claire gathered her papers, sliding them back into the folder without haste. The evidence had been seen, the connections drawn. Whether the family would speak of it openly after tonight no longer felt like her responsibility. The celebration ended without a toast. Plates lay half-finished, and the cake remained untouched in its corner. Guests left in small groups, their conversations drifting into hushed tones as they stepped out into the night. In the parking lot, clusters formed briefly before scattering into waiting cars and taxis. The air outside was cool, carrying away fragments of what had been said inside. Alice stayed in the empty hall. The garlands above her swayed faintly as the air system clicked on, their shadows moving across the walls. She sat alone at one of the round tables, her shoulders slightly hunched, staring at the space where the projector light had been. The quiet was heavier than the noise before it. When she finally spoke, her voice carried only to the empty chairs. The words she had guarded for nearly 30 years came out haltingly, shaped less for Claire than for the memory of herself as a young woman. The tone was not an apology, so much as a confession to the past, an attempt to speak to a version of time that could not answer back. David left quietly, offering a vague promise to give everyone space. His departure was deliberate, an acknowledgement that his presence was also woven into the pattern of choices that had kept the truth hidden. There was no protest in him now, only a tired acceptance of his place in the arrangement. The next morning, Michael waited for Claire by the waterfront. The early light painted the water in pale silver, gulls cutting low arcs above the docks. They began walking without deciding on a direction, their pace unhurried, the city stirring slowly behind them. Claire asked him to show her the places he used to play, the corners of the city where he found shelter from the rain. He led her past venues with new names, past storefronts whose windows now held cafes instead of instruments, and along alleys where the echo of music seemed to cling to the brick. They stopped at a bench facing the water. Michael pointed toward an old warehouse, now converted into apartments, recalling how a friend had once let him rehearse there after hours. Claire listened, not interrupting, storing each detail as if mapping another layer onto her own understanding of the city. Over the following months, small rituals began to form. Some mornings they met for coffee after her planning meetings, sitting by the same window in a narrow cafe where sunlight filtered through hanging plants. Other times, she attended rehearsals of the student ensemble he coached, staying in the back of the room, letting the music fill the space between them. One weekend, they went together to an archival exhibition on Seattle's music scene in the 1990s. Posters, ticket stubs, and grainy performance photos lined the walls. Michael paused in front of a display from the Capitol Hill Jazz Festival, his name printed in small type on the program. Claire took a photograph of the case, framing it as if preserving proof of his place in history. Meanwhile, Alice agreed to attend family therapy. The sessions were tentative at first, her answers clipped and careful. Over time, she began to speak more openly, acknowledging the cost of the choices she had defended for decades. At home, she wrote a letter in her own hand, recounting the events as she remembered them and admitting the truth she had concealed. Claire placed that letter with the others in the shoebox, not as a way to erase what had been done, but to anchor it as part of the record. It became the final page of a story she had pieced together, one that did not absolve but did acknowledge. Driving one afternoon, Claire caught her own reflection in the rearview mirror. She no longer saw the child defined by a single version of family. Instead, she recognized a woman with two surnames that no longer stood in opposition, but folded together into her own identity. The truth had not brought a sudden sense of relief. There was no sharp end to the unease that had accompanied the discovery. But it offered stability, a grounding that came from knowing the shape of the past without shadows left to distort it. In September, they went to the waterfront together, Claire, Michael, and Alice. The day was clear, the water bright under a pale sky. Claire placed a single white gerbera on the railing, the petals catching the light. It was not a token of loss, but a marker of what had been found and kept. They stood there for a while without speaking, the tide moving steadily beneath them. The flower shifted slightly in the breeze, holding its place as the water carried the years away. For Claire, it was no longer a question of who she was. It was the quiet certainty that her name, in full, was hers to keep.